What is so hard about these relationships is that they don't start like this on day one. I always say if you get set up on a date with someone and they hand you a bouquet of flowers and punch you in the face, there's not going to be a second date. That's easy. But that's not what happens here. And so these relationships go in cycles, they intensify over time. And sometimes there's a hint of something that isn't such a problem in the first or second trip on the cycle. But once you're 5 years in, 10 years in, it's really catastrophic. So the fact that it shifts over time can also make it difficult to understand.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Domestic abuse is one of those topics that sometimes we simply wish would go away. It's certainly among the very worst experiences that a person can have, yet it brings forward feelings of shame and failure, such that people are often reluctant to acknowledge that they are victims. Sometimes they won't even name it, either because they don't recognize it for what it is, or because they're embarrassed and don't want to admit it. Yet we can't ignore it, and all of us need to better recognize the warning signs and the red flags, both for those inside and outside of a relationship, and, should such warning signs exist, what we can potentially do about it. Because this is such an important, albeit disturbing topic, I was honored to speak to Keshet Starr, the CEO of Shalom Task Force, to learn more. We talked about the distinction between domestic abuse and domestic violence, the prevalence of male-to-female abuse versus female-to-male abuse, examples of nonviolent abusive behavior, how we can determine when normal behavior crosses the line into emotional abuse or controlling behavior, the range and spectrum of inappropriate controlling behavior, whether the typical abuser is conscious of being an abuser, the way that an abuser often thinks of himself as owning his spouse, answering claims that domestic violence does not occur in Orthodox homes, how abuse takes place in ways that we cannot visibly see, the use of Jewish texts and religious ideas to justify abuse and break boundaries, warning signs and red flags, whether abuse should lead to divorce, or if it can potentially be worked on, and why professionals won't offer an opinion on that question, education against abuse, the meaning of spiritual abuse, barriers to getting help, and more. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com, and let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Keshet Starr is an attorney, advocate, writer, and speaker. Keshet currently serves as the CEO of Shalom Task Force, the nonprofit organization combating and preventing domestic abuse and fostering healthy relationships in Jewish communities. Prior to her work at Shalom Task Force, Keshet led the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, addressing abuse in the Jewish divorce process. Keshet writes for outlets such as Haaretz, The Forward, Kveler, and academic publications, and presents internationally on issues related to domestic abuse, divorce denial, and the intersection between civil and religious legal systems. Keshet also writes and speaks on topics related to Tanakh, with a focus on women's narratives in particular. Keshet was a Wexner Field Fellow and was named one of the Jewish Week's 36 under 36. A graduate of the University of Michigan and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Keshet lives in New Jersey with her husband and 4 young children. Keshet Starr, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to host you. You're in a new position now with the Shalom Task Force, and we're talking about domestic abuse, domestic violence. These are topics which I don't know very much about, and I'm really looking forward to being educated about them because it's such an important topic which is often ignored. So let's start off with exactly that question about terminology. I'd like to understand the terminology before we get into the essential part of our conversation. So Maybe this is a simple question. Is there a distinction between domestic abuse and domestic violence? And either way, can you define those terms?
So that's a great question. You'll hear a lot of different terms in this area: domestic abuse, domestic violence. A term that we use a lot in the field is IPV, which stands for intimate partner violence. You'll hear GBV, which is gender-based violence, all sorts of things. The reason there's been a switch in the domestic violence field from using that term domestic violence to domestic abuse is because one of the biggest misconceptions about abuse is that it's primarily physical. And the word violence really makes us think of physical violence. And so the shift to domestic abuse is really meant to broaden our understanding of what that is and not limit it to only physical violence. But to explain really just from a baseline level, domestic abuse is about a pattern of controlling behavior in a relationship. So a really key part of that term is that it's a pattern. It's really difficult to take one moment in a freeze frame and say, yup, that's abuse, or no, it's not. There are definitely behaviors that are abusive. But what we're really looking at is that big picture of the relationship. What's happening? How are things developing? And what you'll see in abusive relationships is that there's really this pattern over and over of one partner trying to dominate the other partner and one partner restricting the other partner's ability to make their own decisions, have their own kind of independent life.
Speaking in those terms, Keshet, I'm curious about the incidence of domestic abuse. Now, I'm not even speaking about the Jewish community per se, but in general, to what degree is domestic abuse perpetrated by husbands to wives as opposed to wives to husbands or the female partner to the male partner? Because in the way that you broaden the distinction right now, it sounds like it could go in either direction.
So those are all great questions. The number that we hear out in the wider world is that 1 in 4 women will experience domestic abuse. And so that is, as far as we know, the prevalence that we probably have in our community as well, even though due to a whole other complex series of factors that I won't bore you with, it's really difficult to get accurate statistics on the prevalence of different phenomenon in the Orthodox community. But in general, that 1 in 4 number is pretty consistently what's out there. And abuse, as you pointed out, really can go both ways. And this is where I think the association between abuse and violence can trip us up. Because when we think about violence, we're really generally thinking about men being violent towards women. Not that women can't be violent towards men, but maybe less likely. But when we think about it in terms of that control and restriction, that's something that really can go both ways. And I don't think we have great statistics on the prevalence in terms of one gender versus another. And one thing that's a huge challenge when it comes to statistics on this issue is that this is a really underreported issue, that many people are not coming forward and saying that this is what they're experiencing. And because it can be so confusing to be in an abusive relationship, you don't necessarily know what you're experiencing while you're experiencing it as well.
And can you give some examples of nonviolent abusive behaviors, the kinds of things that are abuse that we may not recognize as abuse, or maybe we do recognize them as abuse? What are some examples?
So the way I like to think about it is that an abuser almost has a toolbox. And just like you might use a wrench or a hammer or a screwdriver, all with the same goal, but you're using different tools, abuse will take on these really different classic forms that are all ways of controlling and isolating the other person. So one example is financial abuse, and that can look like a lot of different things. It can mean limiting the other person's access to funds. They don't have a credit card. They don't have the PIN number for the bank account. Sometimes money is used as a way of tracking people. I worked with a woman once whose husband would travel out of town for a week or two at a time. And she would have to account for why the toothpaste was $2.30 and not $1.80. And where did she go to buy the toothpaste? And when did she buy the toothpaste? So the money was kind of an opening for him to really watch her activities, because if she went to meet a friend, he would know that she ran through the gas faster than usual, or that she spent $4 on a coffee in a place that she doesn't normally get coffee. And so you'll see some of of that. Another tool that you'll see as well is digital tracking. So we have our phones with us everywhere we go. It's very common for parents to track their children, and whether or not that's a good thing, I guess it depends on the age, but those tools can also make it really easy for one person to constantly track the other person. When I go somewhere in Waze, it gives me the option to tell someone exactly where I am and when I'm going to arrive, which is helpful because instead of my mother-in-law calling me every 10 minutes to see when we'll be at Thanksgiving, I can use that tool. But in a controlling relationship, that's a really easy way for another person to track where you're going. And that kind of tracking can be done with someone's knowledge and also without someone's knowledge through tracking software or keystroke techniques where you can actually see everything they're typing on their computer. And so tech is another area. Another area as well is sexuality. Sexuality can be a really beautiful, positive thing in relationships. And I always appreciate your Intimate Judaism podcast. And it can also be a really vulnerable area and a really ripe opportunity to really hurt someone and control them. And that can look like pushing someone to have sex when they don't want to, pushing someone to do things sexually that they're not comfortable with, taking explicit photos and then threatening to post those photos, any number of things. It can even mean withholding sex as a form of getting back at someone or punishing someone. So those are just a few examples, and I could go on, but I hope it gives you a sense of the range of tools that abusers can use to really make it very difficult for their partners to have a network of support outside of them and to have the freedom to really determine their own future and their own life in the way that we want everyone to be able to.
That's very helpful. It does give me an idea of what we're talking about. And perhaps this is not an answerable question because I think of Potter Stewart saying, I know it when I see it about pornography. And perhaps the same thing is true here when it comes to abuse. As you mentioned, Keshet, all of those behaviors on their own could be innocuous, or at least most of them, I should say. Maybe some are not innocuous, but many of them, why did you spend so much on the toothpaste is not inherently a terrible question if it's a family that needs to watch its budget and one person is spending more than he or she should and there simply isn't money in the bank. That's not inherently a bad question. So where is that line, if there is such a line, of when something should be seen as abusive or controlling rather than just doing proper diligence and making sure, in that example, the family's finances are in order?
That's such an important question. And I think that question also highlights why it's actually really hard sometimes to recognize that you're in this kind of relationship when you're in it. And that's where the pattern really comes in. We want to look at the big picture of what's happening. And what I will often say is that when I hear a comment like this, first of all, how someone's impacted by it can be a clue as to whether this is happening at a healthy level or an unhealthy level, but also using it as an opportunity to ask more and get a better understanding of what's happening in this relationship and how it's feeling and how it's impacting people. I do think that there is a spectrum, first of all. So it's not like relationships are severely abusive or absolutely amazing. There's a huge range in between. And there's a lot of relationships that aren't good. They're not healthy, happy, beautiful relationships, but they're not abusive. And so there is this kind of fuzzy scale where we can go from these ideal relationships with really strong, healthy communication. Those relationships can have difficult seasons. And then you get into these unhealthy relationships and then abusive, and that can really shift over time. So it's not always so black and white. I do think that in a severely abusive relationship, the kinds of things that are happening really are very different from what you would see in a healthy relationship on its worst day. So that's where you get to that kind of it when you see it. And I would say when it comes to emotional or psychological abuse, which is another tool that an abuser might use, the kinds of comments that you will hear in these kinds of relationships, you really won't hear in a healthy relationship. And so you do find that shift. And I'll share as well, what is so hard about these relationships is that they don't start like this on day one. I always say if you get set up on a date with someone and they hand you a bouquet of flowers and punch you in the face, there's not going to be a second date. That's easy. But that's not what happens here. And so these relationships go in cycles, they intensify over time. And sometimes there's a hint of something that isn't such a problem in the first or second trip on the cycle. But once you're 5 years in, 10 years in, it's really catastrophic. So the fact that it shifts over time can also make it difficult to understand.
Then let me ask, because it doesn't happen in a single moment, it takes time, is the abuser always necessarily aware that he's actually abusing? Or is sometimes the abuser doing these behaviors that maybe he grew up with in his own family and thinks these are normal? In other words, is abuse something which the person is conscious of, or is it something which happens almost organically and naturally without the abuser's realization?
I'll share a story. I, again, am coming to this work after working with agunot for many years, and agunot are survivors of domestic abuse. And I remember in one particular case, a get refuser was really angry with me. And it clicked one day why he was so angry. And I realized to him, it's almost as if I broke into his apartment and stole his TV set off the wall and am, heading down the hallway with it. That he really saw his wife as someone and in some ways something that belonged to him. And the fact that she was trying to leave and there was a team of people helping her do that was really offensive to him. And once I understood that there's kind of this property dynamic here, there's this ownership element, I could understand, not agree, but I could understand why he was so indignant and so angry that all of this was happening. And I think there's a lot of reasons why abusers might have that view of the relationship and other people. There can definitely be a cyclical element where you grew up seeing it and now you repeat it. I happen to think that most of us are going to organically repeat what we grew up seeing unless we're intentional about making a change if we didn't like what we grew up seeing. And so there's that piece of it. And sometimes there's a cultural piece where you're in a culture where you're being taught that this is what marriage looks like and this is what the role of a husband should be. There's all these layers to that. And there's a lot of really contradictory and interesting research about whether or not that can be changed. Is it going to get better if you educate an abuser about what this behavior is, why it's a problem, and try to build accountability? And what we've seen from the research so far is that while intervening with the youth really helps, so better intervention groups that target teenagers have been effective, once someone is really deep into adulthood and they've had multiple relationships and every relationship has had this pattern, it becomes very difficult to change it. So I think that's a hard question to answer in terms of how conscious it is. And I think there is sometimes an element of, well, this is marriage. And I think that's why community education is so critical, because we actually have to explain what marriage should be. We can't assume that that's obvious. I think we actually have to explain that because people are coming from all different environments. They're getting all sorts of messages that can be misinterpreted sometimes in different ways. And we really need to be very clear about what it is we're trying to build when we go into a relationship like marriage.
Before we move off this topic, I still want to ask you something else about domestic violence per se. To what degree is domestic violence, I'm not speaking about abuse broadly, but violence specifically, a problem in the Orthodox community, as best as you know? And the reason I ask about this specifically is because I believe that there are plenty of people who will say, why are we having a conversation about domestic violence at all? That's not an Orthodox issue.
So that's a really powerful question. And I think what we know about domestic abuse is that it really happens everywhere. And whatever is happening in the wider world, whatever statistics are out there, we can assume that that is happening in the Orthodox community as well. There have been homicides in the Orthodox community. They're not on the front page of the Jewish news, but they happen. And they happen in a way that you, as an average person, are probably not seeing. I worked with a woman once who was in a physically violent relationship. And I remember seeing a picture of her injuries. And I hope it's okay to share this. I don't want to traumatize our listeners. I remember seeing a photo of her injuries and they stopped exactly at her elbow, right where your kiki wiki or your shirt would end. And so abusers are smart. Just because they're doing something wrong doesn't mean that they're silly. And whatever is happening in a home behind the scenes, it's not in a place where you can see it. There's a recent book about abuse called No Visible Bruises. And again, just because a bruise isn't visible doesn't mean it isn't there. And I can share from my own experience in this field, physical violence is absolutely happening in our communities, in addition to the rest of it. But the physical violence is happening. And all of the factors that are risk factors for a homicide are things that are happening in our community as well. I would love to say it's somewhere else, but that's not reality.
Kesha, I don't know if this is something which you can answer, but I'm curious to what degree, in your experience, abusers will justify their actions by pointing to something like the Rambam in Hilchot Yishut, the 21st Perek, 10th Halacha, where he says, maybe, it's not clear what he means entirely, that to get your wife to do what you want, you can hit her with a rod. Now, admittedly, the Ravid said we've never heard of such a thing. Rabbeinu Tam says we don't do that kind of thing. The vast majority of Rishonim have rejected the Rambam. Modern scholars like Rav Mordechai Willig of YU have said very forcefully that halachically it is absolutely forbidden to abuse one's wife. Similarly, Rabbi Abraham Twersky Zatzal wrote a book called The Shame Born in Silence about this issue, saying how terrible it is. And finally, in preparation for our conversation, Keshet, I did do a little bit of research on the Rambam, and apparently there are those who say the Rambam doesn't even mean what it sounds like he says, because even though here he says that you can hit with a rod, elsewhere the Rambam says that if one hurts one's wife, one is obligated to pay damages, implying that here he means it idiomatically and not literally. Nevertheless, the Rambam still, in the simple pshat, says that one can hit one's wife. Have you seen people use the Rambam to justify and say, hey, I don't care about Western morality. I quote the Rambam and therefore I'm allowed to do this?
I've definitely seen it. And I think that actually across religious traditions, every religion has a text or two that's tough on this issue. Because also, we haven't been around, since yesterday. We've been around for a while. And Judaism has flourished in many different time periods where the norms around, how you treat your spouse were really, really different. And so I think that any religion, including ours, has some of those texts. And one thing that's really common for abusers is to pull pieces of canon like that and say, well, I'm doing what a good husband should be doing. And you will definitely hear that kind of language. And if you can imagine someone doing that to justify physical violence, then you can really imagine someone doing it to justify a whole lot of other types of abuse.
All right. I'd like to ask you about some of the warning signs. And I mean, not within the marriage. We already spoke about that a bit. But for people outside of the marriage, are there specific signs, if we see them, are red flags that indicate there's some sort of abuse going on?
Definitely. So one of the biggest red flags that I'll highlight, which crosses a few different ones, is really paying attention to how the other person responds to boundaries. And that could mean a lot of different things. So I will say when I speak to students, I'm not here to tell you whether or not you should be shomer negia. That's your business. But if you decide, for example, that you want to be shomer negia, or you put a boundary around your body and someone is pushing on that boundary, that can be a real flag. And I have heard from multiple people who ended up in very abusive marriages that shomer negia was a real flashpoint. And what is, I think, fascinating and disturbing, but really speaks to what you just said. Many of these men used religion to explain why they were pushing at that boundary. That if we don't break shomer negia, then I'm going to go and sleep with another woman, and that would be worse. And so God wants us to be together because we're going to be married, and that God wants you to break this boundary so that we can be together. And it sounds strange, but I've heard this from many people, not just one or two. And so anytime there's a boundary and the person is pushing on that boundary, that's something to pay close attention to. And that could also look like saying, well, our relationship is kind of in a stressful place. I'm going into finals. I just need to not talk to you until Friday when I finish my final. And the person's calling you Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. That anything like that where they really can't respect a boundary is, I think, a huge flag and something to pay attention to. You'll also see it in terms of volume of criticism, that sense of you can't do anything right. Why are you wearing that? Why are you doing that? One thing that can be a flag, which sounds counterintuitive, is actually something called love bombing. And this is where some abusive relationships start out with an over the top courtship that you've been dating for half a week and it's, oh my gosh, I love you and you're beautiful and you're amazing and you're the most incredible person I've ever met. And this kind of over the top affection. And what you'll see is this over the top affection that then shifts into criticism, and it creates this dynamic where you never know what you're going to get from the person, because one day you're the best thing since sliced bread and the next day you can't do anything right. And what that really speaks to is another red flag, which is that walking on eggshells feeling, that it's sort of unpredictable and you have to be really careful and really attuned to the other person. And I will advise people that if you feel like, oh, I kind of want to talk to, Yussi about this, but it's just not worth it. Pay attention to that. It's just not worth it. Why is it not worth it to have a conversation? And those types of things, they're hints and they start in subtle ways, but they can give you a sense that maybe this is an abusive situation, or maybe we just need some real support to learn how to communicate so that we can do this in a successful way. And I think what's true across the board as sort of a hard to pin down flag, but many people who have been in abusive relationships will say that I had this gut feeling that something was off. And maybe I talked myself out of it because I really wanted to get married, or the hall was already booked, or maybe someone talked me out of it. The amount of times I've heard someone say, well, the shadchan said that, they're nervous, but it's gonna, completely fix up once we're married. That our gut and our intuition is really such a gift that can help us highlight when something's off, even when on paper everything's amazing and there's no problem. So really, part of it is, I think, knowing ourselves, trusting ourselves, and really paying attention to when we have a gut and slowing down enough to figure out, well, what does this mean? And it could just mean that we need some extra support, or it could mean something more serious than that, which is why you want to open the door and really see what the best next step is.
Okay, let's talk about the best next step. I'm speaking about two different groups. Number one, somebody who is the victim of an abusive relationship. And number two, somebody who witnesses or suspects that someone may be in an abusive relationship. Let's talk about the first one first. Let's not talk about someone who's not yet married, which presumably the answer is just get out. If a marriage is abusive, is that automatically something which should be cause for divorce immediately? Or is there room to try and fix the problem? At what point does it become insurmountable, in other words?
So it's a great question. And what I will say is that I have yet to meet someone who, after one instance of abuse, is ready to get divorced. I think that for most people, there is a long process. To first realize that they're experiencing abuse, to put that language to it is something that can really take a while. Then to figure out what they might want to do. And there are people who stay in abusive relationships for decades for lots of reasons. And it could be because they're afraid their kids won't get shidduchim. It could be because they're afraid that they won't financially survive otherwise. It could be for any number of reasons. And the approach that we take as professionals in the field is that it's actually not my place to tell you if you should stay or go. Even if I'm really worried about you and I think it's dangerous for you to stay, it's still not my place. All I can do, and it's not just an all, because I think it's actually really impactful, is to give someone information and options and give them tools that meet what they are open to doing. So we will work on safety planning with someone who's staying in an abusive situation. And that's really about tools and techniques that someone can use to keep themselves alive and well when they're in a relationship that is very unpredictable, very dangerous. And sometimes there is a long planning process to leave, but really that's something that the person has to come to on their own. And I think that whether you're a friend or you're a professional, our job is not to tell them what to do and give them marching orders. Our job is to hear what's going on, to support them and to help them figure out what their best next step is, which we can't determine for them no matter how much we want to. And I think that for friends, relatives, we have a domestic abuse hotline that anyone can call. And it's not just for abuse, it's really any relationship issue or a situation that someone's struggling with. And we get a lot of calls from friends and family members that are concerned, and it's a safe space for them to talk. Our hotline is completely confidential. We don't know your name. You might know our name, but we don't know yours. And so you can really say what you want to say without fear of us changing our opinion of you. And a lot of what we do is help family members and friends figure out where are the spaces where they can help and offer support, and where are the spaces where they need to step back and allow the person to make their own decision, no matter how painful and difficult it might be.
I'm really interested in that idea because I certainly concur with this idea of a person must make his or her own decision about life. That's their own decision to make. But it seems to me that in certain situations, it would be negligent not to say you've got to get out of there. If a husband, for example, is physically abusing his wife violently, to say, well, you have to make the decision. I understand sort of on a psychological level why that might be the right answer, but there's a clear and present danger right now. This person could be killed.
So, what I will say to that is that there is a statistic out there that it takes domestic abuse survivors approximately 7 years to leave an abusive situation. And I've heard it quoted, although again, there's not great statistics out there, that in the Orthodox community that might be closer to 14. And it's very
14
common.
years.
Yes, and it's
Wow.
very common for people to leave and go back and leave and go back and leave and go back. That leaving is not a one and done thing. And there's a factor here as well that's really a difficult thing to talk about, but an important part of the conversation, which is that when we think about a risk of a homicide or something very serious like that, one of the most dangerous moments in these kinds of relationships is actually when you leave. Leaving is incredibly dangerous. And so, for people in this situation, there is no great option. That's the hard thing. There's no sort of golden road where if you do this, you're guaranteed safety and freedom. Leaving is dangerous and staying is dangerous. And so, the calculus, I think, actually is more complicated than it might seem, because the act of leaving can come with such profound risk. And also, mothers, especially, I find, and fathers as well, people are concerned about their children. And when you leave an abuser that you share children with, you open up a lot of time where now that abuser is alone with the children, where maybe that wasn't happening before. There's a lot of, challenges that children can experience. And so the calculus that might seem so obvious to us, of course you have to leave and you have to leave now, for the person thinking about the safety risks on both ends, thinking about the impact on their children, thinking about what networks and options they do and don't have outside of their relationship. Because again, it's really common for abusers to isolate their partners from friends and family. So you now have someone that doesn't have this really robust network and their own money or their own job or their own resources. They might have that, but they very likely might not. And so the calculus is much more complicated on the inside. And what I've found is that, bottom line, people won't do it unless they're ready to do it. You can tell them, but sometimes the result of saying you need to leave today is that then when something happens next week, they don't feel like they can call you for support or to brainstorm or to access safety, because like they already told me to leave and I chose to stay. And so it's kind of my fault. And I will share personally, I've had really close people in my life that have been in abusive relationships. And I wanted so badly to do all the things I knew I wasn't supposed to do. I had had a lot of training on domestic abuse support, and I wanted to say, just leave. And I remember being on calls with people and having to physically bite my tongue to keep the words in because I wanted so badly to say them. So all of this is much, much easier said than done. And what I found is that when I have been able to offer that more open support, people came to me later, much later, and they said, because you didn't tell me what to do, I felt like I could always go to you. And I think that piece is huge, that when you offer support. And that doesn't mean, by the way, pretending that you think everything's great. I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, this is what I'm noticing. I'm really concerned. I'm worried about you. I'm worried. I'm noticing these things in your relationship, and I'm worried because I'm concerned that's abusive and that you might be at risk. It's okay to talk to people about what you're noticing and what you're concerned about. But when it shifts to, and now you have to do X, that's where I think you can run into trouble, because if they don't do that immediately, then they might feel like they can no longer go to you for support because they didn't listen to what you advised them to do.
Okay, Keshet, there's a lot that I want to ask based on what you just said. I'm going to try and organize it so that I don't get too far afield and make sure that I catch it all. One thing I want to ask about right now, and this is a very practical question for people listening who suspect abuse. As you said, they can say, is everything okay, without telling them what to do, to approach someone and say, are you okay? I would assume that many people will deny and say, yes, everything is fine. That doesn't necessarily allay one's suspicions. How often should a person, again, there's no one answer, I'm sure, but how often should a person check in again to make sure things are okay? Or if someone says, I'm fine, everything's great, does that mean your job is done? Do you have to keep on checking more if you still suspect something and suspect they're not being upfront with you?
So it's a great question, and I think it's going to depend a little bit on the closeness of the relationship, the rhythm of the relationship, all those pieces. I don't think it's necessarily a one and done, and I think that when speaking to someone, being specific can be really helpful. I noticed X. And sometimes it could be just an aspect of that person. I've noticed that you seem really withdrawn lately, and that's not really like you. And I wanted to just see if everything's okay. Or I've noticed that this thing happened and it felt a little funny to me. Is that something you want to talk about? Is that a conversation we should have? You can open that up to the person. And I think that if someone says, please don't bring this up unless I bring it up, then they're telling you what they find supportive and what they find helpful. But I think that often people will say, nope, everything's fine. And the answer could be, I'm so glad to hear. If anything changes, or if there is anything, that I can do to help you, let me know.
It sounds a lot like some of the questions that friends are supposed to ask friends when they suspect there may be mental illness or depression. To seize that moment and say, are you really okay? Something about what you said is reminiscent of those other conversations.
Yes, and I think that none of us want to be in a position of having to receive help. None of us want to be hungry. None of us want to be mentally ill. None of us want to be in abusive relationships. We don't want to have to be on the receiving end. And I think it is very common to push back and say, nope, nope, I don't need that. Everything's okay. And also, sometimes you plant that seed, and 6 months later or a year later, someone actually takes you up on it. Someone calls and says, actually, I know you mentioned, someone, a good therapist. Can I have that number? And so opening the door, it requires a really long game in a way that's very hard on us. But when we plant seeds and give people space, you really never know when they might come back and open that door. And it might take time, but it has to be on their timeline, because you're not typically going to be able to force them to do it. And especially with domestic abuse. And this was actually something that came to mind. I was reading, I think as many of us have, all these articles about the hostages returning. And one thing I read stuck in my mind, where one of the doctors was sharing how part of the protocol in treating the hostages after they've returned is to ask them before every procedure, is it okay if I take your blood now? Is it okay if I touch your hand? And the reason is because they completely lost agency. They had no agency or control over their own lives. And therefore, in the medical treatment, there was a need to be extremely cautious in a way that wouldn't make sense in another context to give them back that agency. And while abuse is obviously very different, there's this parallel piece where survivors of abuse have been denied the right to make decisions about their lives. And they've been told over and over that they're too stupid and incompetent to make good decisions. And so as helpers, when we say nope, I trust that you are a good decision maker and that you will make the best decision for you. And I'm here to help you, but I trust you that you're smart and you can do this. That's actually a really important part of the healing process. And we're often not helping by forcing something on them, even if we think it's good for them.
Wow, that's really brilliant. That really resonates. Let me ask then, in terms of control, Perhaps again, an unanswerable question. To what degree is abuse the result of a desire for control? Like we often say that sexual violence is not about sex, it's actually about control. Is that true for abuse too always? Or are there other motivating factors behind the reasons that, quote unquote, reasons that an abuser becomes abusive? What's going on? What's the motivation in the abuser's mind?
It's absolutely comes down to control. Control is really the beating heart of domestic abuse. And every tool is really in order to gain control. I'm going to use money to get control. I'm going to use sex to get control. I'm going to use emotions to get control. And I think that what is sometimes going on, and I'm not, a mental health professional, so I'll share with that caveat, is that the abuser sort of associates love with ownership and domination. That the way we might think about love, that love is two people who are humans with needs and thoughts and feelings who are doing life together and finding ways to combine the fact that maybe I love hiking and you only want to be indoors. That's not how abusers fundamentally see relationships. They see it as one person subsuming the other. And so I think it's a very kind of warped idea of what love is and what relationships are. And the reason you see that control piece is that part of why leaving is so dangerous is that when someone fixated on control feels like and is losing control, that creates kind of a panic to then try and create the ultimate control. And while homicide may seem like something only, a crazy person would do, it's the ultimate form of control to decide when another person gets to live or die. And there is a real control piece to that. And so control is absolutely woven in every aspect of abuse. And when there's physical violence, it's not because one person likes to hit the other person. It's a way of gaining control. It's a way of building fear and using that to control another person.
And as you said, I'm sure that sense of control feels like love. It's a misguided love. It feels like love. I'm talking about from the perspective of the abuser. I don't know about one who's abused, but I'm thinking now of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, where essentially there's a devil and the devil says, I love you, which means I want to consume you. Every morsel, he says. That's what I'm thinking of now as you're speaking.
Yeah, it's this again, it's this dominating ownership model of love that is when we think about love as being based on this cornerstone of mutual respect, it's the opposite of that, but it's a warped vision of what it means for two people to be in relationship with each other.
Kesha, in your job, can you talk a little bit about the tensions that exist between the importance and the Jewish value of trying to preserve marriages, preserve relationships, promoting marriage, and preventing abuse? I'm sure those sometimes are at loggerheads.
So that is such a good question. And I think about this a lot. And I'll share for myself. I'm happily married and I'm a big believer in all of the, gifts that marriage can provide. And I think the piece that we get stuck on as a community is the idea that marriage equals happy, healthy, functional relationships. And I wish that were true. I really do. That would be great. But that's not reality. And so we see it as marriage equals success and divorce equals failure without ever knowing what's going on under the surface. It's kind of like if you look in the hood of the car, you get a very different view than just looking at, the paint job. And similarly with marriage, we have this outward view that is shiny and everything's great. And then we hear that someone got divorced. Oh, what a shame. We don't know what's going on kind of under that hood. We don't know what that relationship was really like. And the way I think about our work at Shalom Task Force is that it's not really just about abuse. We're about building strong and happy and healthy relationships. And sometimes that can mean ending a relationship so that you have the possibility to enter another one where that is. But what I think about a lot is making the inside match the outside, making sure that the communication and respect and trust within the marriage is just as shiny and beautiful as, the flower garland on the chuppah and the color coordinated dresses and all that we put into the outward piece. And I think that while we have an anxiety about divorce, that's totally understandable. Some divorces are the best result. Some could be prevented with the right tools at the right time. But I think that our community would be so much better off if we spent less time panicking about divorce and more time investing in marriage. We're actually about to launch a program specifically focused on engaged couples and newly married couples to build core communication skills. And to me, that kind of project can really give people the tools they need right in the beginning before it's 10 years in and they're sitting in a divorce lawyer's office where it's usually too late. So I think we need more investment in what makes relationships really good and less panicking about that divorce in our community that we just heard about.
Then let me ask you, Keshet, about educating people who are not yet engaged. You mentioned right now talking to people who are about to get married. So I guess there are several parts to this question, but when should education to prevent abuse begin? At what age, if there is such an age? And how do we balance educating kids in that way without making them scared of marriage?
Those are such good questions. I would say, in terms of when education should begin, honestly, the earlier the better. We start workshops in ninth grade, sometimes in middle school. And the way that we talk to kids about relationships is that it's not just about marriage. It's also about friendships, about like that camp friend who's texting you 45 times a night and it's too much, but you don't know what to say. Because a lot of times the skills that we can build in boundary setting and communication in lots of relationships only enhance our marriages when we get there one day. So it's really never too early because this isn't about marriage. It's about knowing yourself, trusting yourself, and having the self-worth to communicate, well, this is what's going to work for me and this is what isn't. And if we can train kids to do that when someone wants to copy their paper in eighth grade, that is only laying the groundwork for them to have healthy relationships as adults. And I think the balance of not scaring people and educating people is so critical. And I would say a feedback that I hear all the time is, oh yeah, I had an abuse program in my high school and I wanted to, join a convent afterwards. And so that's not our goal. And we're really thoughtful in the types of examples that we share and what we'll talk about so that we're not causing trauma to anyone. And it's really framed much more about empowering you, about giving you tools and information. There's a lot of conversation about how you can support a friend who might be in something that's making you nervous. And the goal is helping people feel that they have the capability and the strength to make good decisions as opposed to scaring the living daylights out of them, which we very much do not want to do and are really thoughtful about avoiding in how we present it and the kinds of examples that we share.
What happens when a child or a teenager who's in one of these workshops, let's say, you actually are describing their parents' relationship? In other words, it's very easy to say in theory, they come from a great marriage and they're kids and you're teaching them what to avoid. But their model at home may very well be the opposite of what you're talking about. Is there a way you can manage that?
We're always cautious of that. And I will share that in the past, when I've done these kinds of programs about get refusal, I have had children of active cases in the audience, sometimes when I knew and sometimes when I didn't know until afterwards. So we are really mindful when we speak to a group that we do not know who's here and we do not know what they're coming in with. And there's a sensitivity built into how we say things based on that. And I find that the most valuable part about the program is the half hour afterwards where people will come up to you. And that's where you really have an opening to have these conversations. I just actually did my first healthy relationships training for Shalom Task Force yesterday, and I spent an hour in the hallway having those one-on-one conversations. And I think that's one of the biggest gifts of this kind of program, that when there's someone where this is really complicated, there's also a space where they can share one-on-one, and we'll either connect them with other resources or offer the support that we can offer in that conversation.
Again, I want to just push down a little bit more on it, because if a child describes his parents or her parents' relationship and it sounds very abusive, what exactly can you say? Because you can't make this kid run away from home, even though that might be the healthiest thing in some context. That's not obviously going to happen. You have to make sure they respect their parents on some level. Obviously, even what they're describing to you is subjective. It's how they see it, when the parents may be very much not like that. It's how they interpret it. You want to make sure that you don't teach kids that your parents are bad news. they're the models, they're their parents, but at the same time, you don't want them to learn the wrong lessons from their parents. I'm not sure how someone can do that.
It's a tricky balance. What I would probably focus on is what are you noticing? What feels good to you? What doesn't feel good to you? And that can all shape how you develop as a person and what you look for in your own relationships. And I think there's probably a lot of us walking around that have different relationships than maybe what we grew up with, or what worked for our parent won't work for us without abuse even being in the picture. And I think part of growing up in a healthy way is being able to bring more of a critical lens, shall we say, to what you grew up with, and to really think about what are the things that I would want to bring with me, and what are the things that maybe that worked great for mom, maybe it doesn't. Probably only mom can answer that, but I that wouldn't work for me. I'm looking for something a little bit different. And you see that with so many issues. So for me, I think part of it is helping the person develop the tools to analyze what they're seeing that can be more judgmental when you're a teenager and the world is black and white. So that's definitely a piece that's a reality. But part of growing up is figuring out what are the things that I want to bring with me into my suitcase into adulthood, and what are the things that maybe that doesn't work. And I think the more you can know yourself in that way, the better equipped you are to enter into a relationship that's going to work for you.
That makes a lot of sense. Keshet, when we were talking before we went on the air, you mentioned something called spiritual abuse, and I don't know what that is. Could you define it and explain how it's manifest in the Orthodox world?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked. Spiritual abuse is basically when faith becomes part of the abuse. So when we spoke earlier about different tools like finances or sexuality or emotions all being tools that abusers can use to gain control, it sounds funny, but religion is a tool. And I would say that in the Orthodox community, where religion is a huge part of our identity, it is almost impossible for religion not to be interwoven into the abuse. And that can happen in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's taking advantage of halachic situations. So I worked with a woman once who shared that she realized after some time she was in a physically violent relationship, that her husband was much more likely to be violent towards her on Shabbos, because while she would pick up the phone eventually, she would wait longer than on a Wednesday, because you're not supposed to use the phone on Shabbos. So she would feel like she had to let it escalate a little bit before she would call the police, where if the same thing happened on a Tuesday, she'd right away call the police. So that's sort of a simple thing, but that's taking advantage of a halachic practice. Sometimes it will be refusing, really forcing someone to violate a certain halachic tradition. I will say this is where spiritual abuse and sexual abuse can intertwine, but really pushing someone to be intimate during Nida is something that I've heard more times than I can count in these kinds of relationships. And what that does is it creates these sort of layers of suffering where the person feels like, well, maybe God hates me now because I did this huge avera, this major sin. And again, the abuser isn't framing it as, well, I'm pushing to be intimate during Nida because I want to have control over you and I don't like boundaries. The abuser is saying, well, you wore this outfit today and like I couldn't help myself. Like it's always framed in a way that kind of blames the victim. And so you end up with this self-loathing sometimes. The get is a very powerful example of spiritual abuse. It's taking what is supposed to be just a religious ceremony and turning it into a weapon and a way to control someone. And you see this, by the way, across religions. You speak to evangelical Christian women, and they will share specific pieces of the Bible that are quoted at them, specific areas where this comes up. Muslim women, very similar. In any community where religion is how we really make meaning and how we develop our own identities, religion is almost certainly going to be interwoven into the abuse. And that's what makes it so damaging. But that's also why it's so important that as a firm community, we understand the issue. And sometimes early stages of control can be someone saying, well, we need to be more, machmir, or we need to adopt these extra chumras. And that's not to say that because someone wants to be Chalav Yisrael, they're abusive. But I'm saying that these things can get very messy and intertwined. And sometimes religious concepts can be really manipulated in order to allow one person to control the other person, all through the lens of I'm just being a good Jew or I'm doing what a Jewish husband or wife is supposed to do.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking about what you said earlier that withholding sex can be a form of abuse. And I'm just thinking now about a situation where, let's say, the husband or wife says, I'm not going to have sex because I'm in nida, and the other partner isn't interested in that. Where that might appear to one partner as a type of abuse, whereas the other partner genuinely is just trying to do what the Torah says.
And so it's a great question. And I think that's where I'll keep going back to that element of pattern. It is rare that you will see really intense sexual abuse and nothing else going on. Usually there's multiple forms of abuse that are happening, and that control element is woven in throughout the relationship. So that's where, again, someone could take an isolated moment and say, look, it's abuse. And by the way, abusers love to say that they're victims of abuse. So it gets even more complicated. You can take a moment and try to say, oh, that's abusive. But what it really comes down to is what's sort of the overall pattern and character of the relationship. And even again, outside of abuse, this is relevant. So, for example, couples fighting. That's normal. In fact, I would say if you never fight, that probably means there are some pretty important issues you're not talking about. But fighting 3 times a year is different than fighting 5 times a day, right? That's sometimes also the prevalence where something's coming up can really give you a clue as to whether this is something unhealthy or abusive or something that is just humans living life together with all of the messiness that comes with that. And I try to share also when I speak that anger can be a red flag. And also, it's normal for people to get angry. Just the fact that you get angry or your partner gets angry doesn't mean there's something wrong with you and this is an abusive situation. It's really more about how you engage in that anger and what that shows up as. And so it's really about thinking through what's kind of a normal human dynamic and what is getting to the point where it's interfering in your ability to live a functional and healthy life together.
But I'm going to assume, Keshet, that there is at least one exception to that rule that it's about a pattern, and that would be in the case of literal violence. If a husband hits his wife, I assume that one strike and you're out, meaning that is officially abuse. We can't say, well, it's part of a pattern only. Are there other things as well, assuming that you agree that that's true, that one time is too much, obviously? Are there other things that also a single time is already demonstrating a type of abuse, and it's not about a pattern, it's about a specific action?
So it's a good question. I would say marital rape would fall in that category. There's other things like that. And the way I will put it is that in those scenarios, if you looked for a pattern, you would almost certainly find one. So it's not to say that you need a pattern, but that again, it's rare that you would have physical violence in one particular moment of time and nothing else anywhere else. That typically sometimes there's one thing that gets law enforcement involved, that brings you into court, that brings children's services involved. And then you you lift the hood of the car and you see that everything's rusted. But it's rare that you're going to just have one thing without that pattern existing, whether you sort of need it or not.
Kesha, what are the biggest barriers to people getting help, people who are victims of abuse? What are the biggest reasons that they don't get that help that they should be getting?
So there are so many barriers. One barrier is actually using the term abuse to describe what you're experiencing. A lot of people have trouble identifying anything beyond physical violence as abuse. And some people really resist that label. So I've in the past, when I've sent people to referral sources that will only help them if they're survivors of abuse, I'll coach them on, make sure you share that story about what happened at the birthday party. I think that'll help them understand what's happening. And I know that that will get them categorized as abuse survivors, but I know they're not going to use that word. So just the language, it seems basic, but language is the gateway. If you don't know what you're dealing with, then you can't even start to get help. I think there's also sometimes a concern that calling for help will mean that I have to leave and I might not be ready or willing to leave. And so that's why it's so important to know that those of us in these roles trying to help are not here to make you do something or to tell you to do something. We're here to be really a safe container where you can share what's going on. But I think a lot of people are worried that making a call will sort of be the first domino that leads to all these consequences that maybe they're not ready for or they don't want. Another barrier is that when we look at this issue in kind of a clinical way, we say, okay, there's abuse happening and that's not okay. And so obviously the relationship should end. But for the person in the situation, not only are the consequences and the barriers more complicated, but this is also someone that you love, that you also have good memories with, that you stood under a chuppah with, that you wanted to retire to Florida with, or whatever it is. There's a lot of like other stuff too that can make it really hard to figure out, well, is there a way that I can just get the abuse to stop, but the relationship to continue? It's just messy because these are real emotions and real people, and it's not as black and white as it might seem to someone else or to someone on the outside. It's just not that simple when you're in it.
Okay, Keshet, this has been difficult to hear, but very interesting, and I appreciate your candor. Let me ask you about Shalom Task Force itself. What exactly is that organization that you head now? And a person who suspects abuse, either in his own life or her own life, or from outside, how can Shalom Task Force help that person?
So, Shalom Task Force was actually started in 1993 by a group of community members, and it was really ahead of its time in having a conversation about abuse and healthy relationships in a moment where that was really not on the table. And what we do now is that we work to prevent this issue from happening as much as possible and to support people that are experiencing it. So we have a hotline where it's confidential. You can call about yourself, about someone else, and we will be a listening ear. We'll help connect you with resources, and we're really there to support you with whatever you might need, which is going to be different for everyone. We also have a legal team, so we provide legal services for survivors of domestic abuse that might need help with an order of protection, with a matrimonial or custody case, etc. And then we also run educational programs, and that's where we go into schools, to colleges, to communities. We work with rabbis and rebbitzins and college teachers, lots of different audiences. And our goal for that is to really think beyond abuse, honestly, in terms of what are the building blocks to have a healthy relationship and what are the ingredients that you can bring to the table to have a healthy and strong relationship. And we really focus on building that as opposed to only talking or thinking about this worst case scenario. And so that's really the mix of what we do. And we're also working on lots of creative projects and different kinds of interventions. But I would say there is no cost to calling, there's no cost to receiving our services. And if it's something on your mind, or you even just want a place to talk out what you're noticing or experiencing, we're really here for that. And the importance of the confidentiality is that a huge barrier for help sometimes in the Orthodox world is that within our community, we're afraid of being recognized because it's really small, close-knit community. And outside of our community, it's hard for people to get it. Are they going to understand what my life is like and what I'm dealing with? And so we really combine those. We're in the community. We understand what you're dealing with. We know that Pesach is in 2 days. We're still answering the phone. And yet we can provide that confidential space where you don't have to worry that we're going to know who you are and that we're going to share anything that you've shared with us. That really stays in a very sacred and contained space. And we work to ultimately create a community where I always say that our marriages should look as good on the inside as they do on the outside. And our goal is to equip our community across the board with the tools to build lasting, healthy, wonderful relationships, because we all deserve to be in relationships that uplift us and that help us accomplish all the things that we want to accomplish in our lives.
Okay, Keshet, one final question. If you have a short message for anyone who's listening that you would like to get out there about domestic abuse, what would you say?
So the message I would share to really anyone listening is that domestic abuse happens here too. It's not just out there. It's not just other people or other hashkafas. It's in your community. You just don't know it. And that's why we all need to come together and be proactive in building the kinds of relationships that we want our kids to be in, that we want to be in. And what I would share for anyone listening that might be experiencing abuse is that it's not your fault. You're not alone, and that there really is a whole network out there of advocates and people that are here to support you and walk with you on the path that you choose, because this is your life and we're here to walk alongside you.
Keshet Starr, I always enjoy speaking with you, and I enjoy learning from you, so I appreciate your joining me today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.